The last gunshot of World War II wasn't fired in battle. It echoed through a silent forest, a gunshot that shouldn't have happened at all. Because when that bullet flew, the war was already over. He didn't know it. No one in his unit did. And yet, one man's disbelief turned peace into tragedy. Before you scroll, hit subscribe, drop a like, and stay till the end. Because this story isn't about victory or defeat. It's about the silence between the last order and the last heartbeat. The morning of May 8, 1945 began like any other for Private Otto Meinhardt. Cold, grey, heavy with the smell of smoke and wet earth. He was 22, huddled in a shallow trench somewhere between Czechoslovakia and southern Germany. Around him the forest lay still. No artillery, no shouting, only the faint creak of trees and the drip of rain from broken branches. For the first time in years there was silence. And that silence scared him more than gunfire ever had. Otto clutched his rifle, the steel biting into his palms. The weapon that had once made him feel invincible now felt like a burden. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His commander had vanished the night before. The only things left were fear and rumors. Berlin had fallen. The Führer was dead. The Americans were already in Munich. But the one rumor no one dared believe was the simplest. The war is over. How could something so enormous simply stop? How could millions of lives burning for 6 years suddenly go quiet? He looked at the faces around him, thin, hollow men staring into fog, and saw that they didn't know either. Orders had defined them. Now there were none. Without a war, what were they? A pale mist crawled through the trees, thick as breath. Somewhere far off came a shout in Russian, then nothing. Otto squinted through the haze, heartbeat drumming in his ears. He was the lookout. If he saw movement, he was to fire. That was the last command he'd ever been given. He wondered if obeying it still meant anything. Hours passed. The forest stayed gray and endless. Then a sound, boots on leaves, slow, deliberate. Otto's hands tightened. Through the fog a figure appeared, a man, alone, walking with hands raised. His uniform was Soviet, torn and blood-stained. He was unarmed. His face looked older than time. When he spoke, the words came rough and broken. Krieg ist vorbei. The war is over. No one moved. The words hung in the cold air like ghosts. One of Otto's comrades whispered, "It's a trick." The Russian took another step forward. "No fight," he said softly. "War finish." Otto's breath caught. His finger rested on the trigger, trembling. Could it be true? Could all of this end with just 3 words? Then, suddenly, the stillness shattered. A single rifle crack slicing through the fog. The Russian jerked backward, stumbled, and fell. Otto spun. One of his own men stood frozen, rifle smoking. "He was lying," the soldier stammered. "He moved, I thought." But there was no weapon, no threat. Only a dying man bleeding into the mud. Otto dropped his gun and ran. He pressed his hands against the wound, feeling the heat of life slipping away. The Russian gasped once, eyes wide with something between surprise and peace. Then he was still. For a long time, Otto just stared. His breath fogged in the air, mixing with the smoke from the shot. And then, faintly, he heard it. A bell. One, then another. Distant church bells ringing across the valley. Not alarm bells and celebration. The war had ended hours ago. The world outside this forest already knew. He looked down at the man he'd failed to save and felt something crack inside him. That shot, that final useless shot, had killed the truth. He whispered, "You were right." His voice broke. The fog drifted upward, carrying the sound away. The others said nothing. They just stood there, rifles lowered, faces blank. The silence returned. But now it felt heavier, sacred, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Otto rose slowly. The sunlight began to break through the branches, thin and golden. It painted the mud and the blood the same color. For the first time since the war began, he saw the world without smoke. And it terrified him. He turned toward the rising sun, whispering to no one, "Maybe it's really over." He dropped his rifle into the mud. The sound it made was soft, almost merciful. Around him other soldiers followed. Helmets fell, metal clinked, uniforms rustled, as men who'd lived by war suddenly found nothing left to fight for. Otto looked at the horizon. The light spread wider now, burning the fog away. Somewhere beyond the trees the bells kept ringing, louder, freer. He closed his eyes and listened. Each note felt like both a wound and a blessing. He knelt beside the dead soldier, brushed the mud from his sleeve, and whispered a promise only the forest would hear. "I'll remember." Then he rose and walked into the sunlight, leaving behind the rifle, the grave, and the echo of the last gunshot of the war. It would follow him forever, not as the sound of battle, but as the sound of peace arriving one heartbeat too late. The next morning the forest was still. No gunfire, no commands, only birdsong too delicate for men who'd forgotten what peace sounded like. Otto Meinhardt walked between the trees, his boots sinking into mud that smelled of rain and ashes. Behind him the fog had lifted. Ahead lay an empty road curving through ruined hills. He had survived the war, but he didn't feel alive. Hours later, a convoy appeared, American jeeps moving slowly, their engines humming like distant thunder. Soldiers in clean uniforms, faces calm, rifles lowered. Otto didn't resist. He simply raised his hands. A young American sergeant stepped forward, studied him for a long moment, then said in careful English, "You done fightin', buddy?" Otto nodded. That was the last decision he ever made as a German soldier. They gathered the prisoners by the hundreds. Rows of men once feared across Europe now stood motionless, stripped of weapons, waiting for instructions that would never come. Some still wore medals pinned to torn tunics. Others had tossed theirs into the dirt. The air smelled of surrender, sweat, mud, and disbelief. An officer read from a paper, his voice flat. "All German forces have capitulated. You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention." But the words drifted past Otto like wind through broken glass. He couldn't hear meaning anymore, only tone. Calm, steady, merciful. They began to march south. The sun rose high and cruel, bleaching the landscape into shades of white and gray. Villages slid by, burned farms, collapsed barns, churches missing steeples. Children watched from doorways with faces too old for their years. Women carried water in silence. Every mile felt like walking through the aftermath of a dream-turned-nightmare. The column moved for hours, sometimes days. Sleep came in fragments, food in scraps. But what haunted them most wasn't hunger or exhaustion. It was the quiet. No marching songs, no shouted orders, no engines overhead, only the shuffle of boots and the whisper of wind through shell-scarred trees. One afternoon, they reached a small town. The bells were ringing again, celebrating peace. The sound cut through Otto's chest like guilt. In the square, an American truck idled beside a fountain. A soldier with freckles and a tired smile handed out loaves of bread. The prisoners hesitated, expecting mockery. The soldier just shrugged. "Eat. War's done." Otto took a piece, tore it in half, and passed the rest to the man beside him. The bread was warm. It tasted of life. For the first time, he realized that mercy had a flavor. As they marched on, the landscape began to change. Fields of young wheat shimmered in the wind. Cows grazed in meadows that somehow survived the firestorms. Everywhere he looked, the world was quietly repairing itself. Birds built nests inside the ruins of tanks. Flowers pushed through cracks in the asphalt. It was as if nature itself had decided the war was beneath it. At dusk, they stopped near a bridge over the Danube. The river glimmered under the fading light, wide and endless. Otto stared at it for a long time, thinking of home, of his mother's kitchen, his father's workshop, the smell of bread and sawdust. Somewhere beyond that water lay everything he'd lost. A lieutenant beside him whispered, "The same river flows through Vienna, through Bavaria, through all of it." Otto nodded. The water moved on, uncaring who had won or lost. They camped that night in an open field, fenced with barbed wire. No tents, no fires. Men lay on the ground, shivering beneath the stars. Some wept quietly. Others stared upward as if expecting orders from heaven. Otto closed his eyes but couldn't sleep. Every time he drifted off, he saw the Russian's face, the man who'd said the words he hadn't believed. The war is over. Around midnight, he woke to soft voices. 2 American guards sat by the fence sharing cigarettes. One said, "Guess they're just kids, same as us." The other replied, "Yeah, just on the wrong side of the story." Their laughter was low, not cruel, just tired. Otto listened, realizing that in another life, he could have been one of them. When dawn came, a jeep pulled up carrying coffee cans. The smell spread through the camp, rich, bitter, unreal. The guards poured cups for themselves, then hesitated. One soldier, perhaps out of impulse, filled another cup and passed it through the wire. Otto took it. The steam curled against the morning chill. He didn't say thank you. He just drank, slowly, as if the warmth could reach the part of him still frozen in the forest. Later that day they marched again, heading west toward a larger camp. The roads grew busier, convoys of prisoners, columns of refugees, wagons piled with furniture and children. The war had turned the continent into one long migration of the lost. By afternoon, rain returned. Sheets of water fell from a sky the color of steel. The men kept walking, their uniforms soaked, boots squelching in mud. But this time no one complained. The rain felt clean, almost forgiving. It washed the blood from their hands, the dust from their faces, the smoke from their hair. It was as if the heavens themselves were trying to rinse away what they had become. At one crossroads, they passed an American military band. The musicians stood under makeshift tents, playing swing music for a group of locals. Trumpets, drums, laughter. The rhythm drifted toward the prisoners like a language they'd never known. Some smiled for the first time in years. Otto couldn't help but imagine what it would be like to dance again, to be human again. That night they rested beside an abandoned farmhouse. The walls were cracked, but the roof still held. Otto sat by a window, staring at the horizon glowing faintly from distant fires. He thought about the Russian soldiers' last words and realized something terrifying. The war might be over, but its echoes would never stop. They would live on in memory, in nightmares, in the silence between breaths. He tore a page from his notebook and began to write, not orders or reports, but thoughts. If peace ever returns, he wrote, it will sound like bells through fog, and it will hurt. Outside, the rain eased. Frogs croaked near the riverbank. Somewhere in the darkness, an American sentry hummed a tune. Otto recognized it, something from the radio years ago, before everything had turned to ashes. He closed his eyes and let the melody carry him. For the first time since the war began, he didn't feel like a soldier. The next morning, as the column moved again, the road curved upward into hills bright with morning light. Below them, valleys shimmered in mist. The world looked untouched, almost innocent. But Otto knew better. Every field, every tree, every stone held ghosts now. Still he walked on. Step after step, breath after breath. No flags, no pride, no hatred, only a quiet understanding that survival itself was an act of surrender. When the trucks finally stopped, the prisoners were too numb to react. The engines went quiet, leaving only the ticking of metal cooling in the morning air. Before them stretched a vast plain surrounded by wire fences and wooden towers. It wasn't the nightmare they expected. There were no whips, no shouting guards, just order, structure, and the smell of something they had forgotten existed. Fresh bread. The Americans called it Camp Ashford. To Otto Meinhardt, it looked like another world. Rows of barracks painted white, gravel paths neat and straight, signs written in both English and German. At the gate stood an officer with silver hair and tired eyes. His voice carried across the yard, calm and even. You are prisoners of war. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The words didn't sound like propaganda. They sounded like a promise. Inside, men received blankets, soap, and uniforms marked PW. They lined up for food, hot stew, bread, coffee. The steam rose like something holy. Otto hesitated with the spoon in his hand. Around him, others began to eat, cautiously at first, then hungrily. Someone laughed, a strange, fragile sound, and everyone turned as if afraid of it. That night, for the first time in years, Otto slept on a mattress. The silence in the barracks wasn't fear anymore. It was peace, awkward and new. In the distance, a train passed, its whistle echoing like a lullaby. For 6 years, trains had meant only one thing, death. Now it meant home, somewhere far away. Days became weeks. The Americans kept their word. No abuse, no starvation, no cruelty. They worked the prisoners hard, fixing fences, clearing rubble, unloading supplies, but they paid them in small coupons redeemable for cigarettes, chocolate, or writing paper. Otto used his to buy a notebook. He began to write every evening about the forest, the Russian soldier, the bells, and the strange kindness of the enemy. One morning, a new sight stopped him cold. A group of American soldiers stood near the kitchen, black men and white men working side by side, laughing as they carried crates of food. For Otto, raised on propaganda about racial purity, it was unthinkable. Yet here it was, normal, casual, accepted. That image stayed with him longer than any battle. It was proof that everything he'd been taught had been a lie. He began to notice other details. The guards joked with prisoners, shared cigarettes, even taught them English phrases. Good morning. Thank you. Peace. Simple words that sounded heavier than they should. Sometimes American farmers came to the camp, looking for laborers to help in their fields. Otto volunteered. The first time he stepped beyond the fence, he felt free, but also ashamed. The farmer who hired him, an older man with weathered hands, greeted him with a handshake. No hesitation, no hatred. We'll pay you fair, the man said. Just work honest. The farm was quiet except for the sound of wind through wheat. Otto hadn't seen so much open land since before the war. He worked alongside other prisoners, planting, harvesting, repairing barns. The farmer's wife brought them water in glass jars, even pie on Sundays. Once she noticed Otto watching the horizon and said softly, "It'll grow back, you know. The land always does." Something inside him broke then, not from pain, but from understanding. The war had taught him destruction. Now strangers were teaching him forgiveness. In the evenings, he sat on the farmhouse steps watching the sunset turn the sky gold. The farmer's son, a boy of 10, sometimes sat beside him, asking questions in broken German. "Did you fly planes? Did you shoot guns?" Otto always answered the same way. Not anymore. Back in the camp, change spread quietly. Prisoners started organizing concerts, language classes, even a small newspaper written in both languages. They painted murals on the barracks walls, landscapes, families, faces that looked alive again. The Americans encouraged it. They wanted these men to go home different from how they'd arrived. One afternoon, Otto stood by the wire fence watching the guards. A chaplain passed by, nodded and said, "You know, the war's over for us. You just have to decide if it's over for you." Otto didn't answer, but he understood. The war would end for him the day he stopped hating. As the months passed, letters from Germany began to arrive. Some brought joy, families alive, homes still standing. Others carried grief. Otto's letter came in winter. His mother's handwriting trembled across the page. "The house is gone," she wrote. "Your father, too. But I am alive. Come home when you can. We'll start again." He folded the letter and held it to his chest. For a long time, he just stood there, eyes closed, breathing the cold air that smelled faintly of pine and coffee from the kitchen. Spring came early that year. Snow melted into soft earth, and the fences looked less like cages, more like boundaries that would someday open. The Americans began releasing groups of prisoners. Each departure felt like the closing of a chapter written in blood and mercy. When Otto's name was finally called, he stood before the same silver-haired officer who had welcomed them months ago. The officer handed him a slip of paper and said, "You're free to go. Good luck, soldier." Otto hesitated, then extended his hand. The officer shook it without hesitation. As he left, Otto looked back at the camp one last time, the place that had captured him, fed him, and somehow saved what little of his soul was left. He whispered, "Thank you," though no one heard it but the wind. The journey home was long and uncertain. The train rolled through landscapes scarred by fire but alive with rebirth, fields green again, children playing beside rivers, women hanging laundry where tanks once stood. In the window's reflection, Otto saw not a soldier but a man learning how to live again. When he finally stepped off at a small station near what used to be his village, he saw ruins and flowers growing side by side. A woman stood waiting by a tree, gray-haired, fragile, smiling through tears. His mother. She opened her arms. "You're home," she whispered. That night, Otto sat outside their rebuilt house, watching the stars appear one by one. The world was quiet again, but it wasn't the terrifying silence of that forest years ago. It was the silence of peace, fragile, imperfect, and alive. He thought of the Russian soldier who had said, The war is over, and knew that finally, after all this time, those words were true. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring. Their sound rolled over the hills like memory and forgiveness intertwined. Otto closed his eyes and let them wash over him. Each note carried a message he would never forget, that even after the darkest storm, humanity could still choose light. He smiled faintly, whispered to the night, "Rest easy, comrade," and listened to the sound of peace lingering like the last echo of a prayer.